Hello, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Benedikt Brisch. I'm the director of the German Center for Research and Innovation, the DWIH, or German Center for Research and Innovation here in New York City. And it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the live webinar COVID-19 and the Future of Our Cities, initiated by the University Alliance Ruhr, one of the long-standing supporters of our center. GCRI, the German Center for Research and Innovation, appreciates very much today's cooperation of the Institute of Public Urban Health at the University of Duisburg-Essen, together with their partners, the College of Allied Health at the University of Cincinnati, and the Rethinking Cities Institute, Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh. As all higher education and science institutions worldwide, the German Center for Research and Innovation had to switch all of our activities to virtual since March 2020, of course, due to the COVID-19 crisis. The difference with the event today is that it was not planned as an on-site event like other things we had in mind, where we had to switch to virtual this year so far. Today's event was planned as a virtual webinar from the beginning. Virtual activities seem to be our new normal now, and we don't know when we can return to on-site activities, including what we always wanted you to encouraging mixing and mingling. That's not the time for it now in the Corona or COVID-19 crisis, unfortunately. The German Center for Research and Innovation is located in New York City, and this is one more reason why we are interested in the discussion of experts about how COVID-19 will affect how we think about the city of tomorrow, and maybe how cities of tomorrow will be shaped and organized. Today's webinar will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the poor, minorities, and immigrants in post-industrial cities, such as the Ruhr region, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. And it is one of several COVID-19 and the city webinars to come in the near future. Allow me very briefly to highlight the German Center for Research and Innovation as an institution and structure that is making today's event possible. Since 2010, German Centers for Research and Innovation were founded in 5 countries worldwide on the initiative of the German Federal Foreign Office and also funded by the German Ministry of Federal Foreign Affairs Office. These centers are managed by the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, and today we have 5 of these centers working in Sao Paulo, New Delhi, Moscow, Tokyo, and here in New York. The goal of our centers is to promote international dialogue on science and technology and to facilitate collaborations to solve the most pressing questions of the future on a global level. And I think here we have one more of these activities with our distinguished experts today. Here in New York, the German Center for Research and Innovation is proud to have more than 35 supporters. The German science organizations, including the DFG, Max Planck, Leibniz, Alexander von Humboldt, and many others. And of course, we're very proud to have more than 30 German universities and universities of applied science and the German American Chambers of Commerce as our supporters. So if you're interested to know more about our activities, please visit our website, dwih-newyork.org, and you can register for our newsletter and the upcoming events where we bring together scientists and innovators from Germany and the United States. Thank you. And with this, I would want to hand over to Peter Rosenbaum, and I'm looking forward to our statements of the experts and our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome everyone to our panel discussion on COVID-19 and the future of our cities. My name is Peter Rosenbaum, and I'm the Executive Director of the University Alliance Ruhr office here in New York. Our alliance is a consortium of Ruhr University Bochum, TU Dortmund University, and the University of Duisburg-Essen. With today's conversation and future events that we are currently planning, as Ben has already mentioned, we would like to connect with researchers and practitioners, as well as community and city representatives to help us understand how the COVID-19 pandemic will affect how we think about cities. I couldn't think of a better panel of experts to kick off today's conversation, and let me introduce and welcome our speakers. Dr. Françoise Knox-Kazimierczuk is an assistant professor in the Department of Rehabilitation, Exercise and Nutrition Science at the University of Cincinnati. In her scholarship, Françoise combines a critical race theoretical framework with the principles of community-based participatory research to address racial health disparities. Françoise is currently conducting several research studies focusing on the intersections of race, class, gender, and community health. Her recent projects include a study on the impact of COVID-19 and out-of-hospital births in Hamilton County, and a study on social isolation and loneliness during COVID-19 and the implications on health behaviors. Françoise, welcome to our panel. Dr. Susanne Moebus is a professor of urban epidemiology at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, where she is also the director of the new Institute for Urban Public Health at the medical faculty at the University of Duisburg-Essen. Susanne is a member in a number of advisory boards and steering committees, including the Data and Access Committee of the German National Cohort Study. Her current projects include acoustic quality in health and urban regions, the 1000 Brain Study, and a European Union project on clever cities. Welcome, Susanne. Last but not least, Don Carter is a senior research fellow at the Remaking Cities Institute at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he also teaches in the urban design program. Prior to joining Carnegie Mellon in 2009, Don was president of Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh, where for over 36 years, he led many of the firm's most complex projects in the US and abroad, drawing upon his broad international experience as an architect and urban designers. His latest book is Remaking Post-Industrial Cities, Lessons from North America and Europe, documenting 10 case studies on cities such as Pittsburgh and the Ruhr region. Don, welcome to our panel. Thank you, Susanne, Françoise, and Don for joining us today. And also a big thank you to Ben, Dietrich, Julia, Jared, and Anne-Sophie, the fabulous team at the German Center for Research and Innovation here in New York, for helping us host this event. We will proceed as follows. Don is going to deliver opening remarks, followed by brief presentations by Françoise and Susan. We will then have a Q&A session where we would like to invite you, our audience, to ask questions, and please use the Q&A function for that. We will answer questions live rather than in writing. And I would like to thank all of you who have already submitted questions. We have received quite a lot of them. So my apologies to all of you whose questions we might not be able to address because of time constraints. Having said this, I'm turning it over to you, Don.
Well, thank you, Peter. Greetings from Pittsburgh to all of you, especially to those in the Ruhr region, a sister comeback post-industrial region. Last October, I was fortunate to be in the Ruhr to speak at the Gambrinus Forum in Dortmund, and I was able to tour the beautiful Emscher Landscape Park. I'm going to repeat Ben's opening comment for those who joined this webinar after we started. This first conversation in this seminar series being sponsored will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the poor, minorities, and immigrants in post-industrial cities such as the Ruhr region, Cincinnati, and my hometown of Pittsburgh. And the question is, what is the role of place, race, and class in the current pandemic? And how might we rethink city planning and public health practices and policies to combat future pandemics? My remarks today are going to focus on urban planning and COVID-19. And as we have all experienced, the lockdown has profoundly changed how we use the city, but it also will have long-term impacts on how we view our cities in the future. The big categories of change will be in transportation, buildings, and infrastructure. If social distancing becomes the norm, then density must be dealt with. Are our cities too dense? Will people shun public transit? Will people move to the outer rings of cities and rural areas? Will that increase the use of private automobiles and negatively impact air quality and climate change? Will that also increase the wealth gap and segregation between those who can afford to move and those who cannot? And what do we lose if our cities decline? A recent New York Times editorial entitled "The Cities We Need" stated, quote, "Cities supplied the keys for unlocking human potential, an infrastructure of public schools and colleges, public libraries and parks, public transit systems, and clean, safe drinking water. The very density and diversity of urban life fostered the accumulation of knowledge, the exchange of ideas, and the creation of new products," end quote. Can we afford to lose that creative energy unique to dense urban life? Will working from home become more prevalent? Will office buildings become vacant as a result? Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO and founder of Twitter, told all its employees this week that they could work remotely forever if they want to and if their position allows it. Billionaire Warren Buffett said recently, quote, "A lot of people have learned that they can work at home," end quote. But can you work at home as a team from home? And what about social interaction? We've seen a rise in mental health problems related to isolation and loneliness during the global shutdown. How will building codes and zoning ordinances change to create better public health protections against pandemics? Is our food supply chain safe and secure? How will this impact bars and restaurants? How will we have future public gatherings that are safe, such as cultural events, sporting events, celebrations, parades, and festivals? Almost all sporting events globally have been canceled or postponed. Last month, Munich canceled the 2020 Oktoberfest. Public regulations for hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, doctors' offices, salons, and spas will be strengthened. Schools and universities have been greatly affected by COVID-19, from having to teach online to developing new standards for food service, housing, and classrooms when students finally return to school. But of particular concern for today's discussion is the impact of COVID-19 on the poor, minorities, and immigrants. I can sum it up in one sentence. When things go bad, the poor die. The COVID-19 pandemic is just the latest example. Poor people have the least access to health care and healthy food. They frequently live near factories, mines, sewage treatment plants, urban highways, contaminated soil, polluted water, incinerators, and power plants. Housing is often substandard and overcrowded. Underlying health conditions like diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, heart problems, and asthma are prevalent. The majority of people living in poverty are usually in single-parent households with children and the destitute and elderly who live alone. It should be no surprise that COVID-19 mortality rates are higher for the poor. And this plays out even worse for minorities, immigrants, and refugees, who have a higher proportion of people living in poverty. Your class, your race, and where you live matter when things go bad. And I'll leave you with a quote from a phone call I had yesterday with Peter Seaman, a public health official in Glasgow, Scotland. Quote, "Inequalities in health are related to inequalities in wealth, power, and place," end quote. Thank you. And now over to you, Fran.
Thank you, Don. I just want to kind of expand upon that. My focus is really going to be on talking about the intersection of race and class, specifically looking at the data that's been coming out of the CDC and the data that's been coming out of some of the local health departments here in the US. And so we've all been hearing the stories and reading the op-eds in the New York Times, or reading the stories from NPR, or seeing the stories that are appearing on our channels with the news, looking at the disproportionate rate of transmission along with the disproportionate rates of fatality for minority communities, and particularly looking at poor minority communities. So once we start sifting through some of the data, per the CDC, 30% of the confirmed cases that we know race and ethnicity for are African Americans. And when you start looking at some of the city data, particularly looking at Chicago, you have rates as high as 50% of transmission being African Americans, with 70% of fatality being from African American communities. And as you start combing through the data a little bit further, if you get to neighborhood-based data, you can also see that in Chicago, it's specifically in 5 neighborhoods where we're seeing the highest number of cases, the highest numbers of fatalities, and these are poor non-white communities on the south side of Chicago. And looking at the data in other urban centers, we're seeing this also fleshing out there as well. I actually just received data from the city of Cincinnati and just gained access this week to some GIS data where I was able to go through the process of looking at where the predominant number of cases are in the city, which are 3 neighborhoods, and overlaying some of the GIS data related to poverty, related to non-white residents, and also related to diabetes. Those neighborhoods that had the highest rates of diabetes, more non-white populations, and higher poverty rates, those are the same neighborhoods that have the highest number of cases, which is not surprising. The thing that we know in relationship to being poor, being minority, or being an immigrant, there is, those particular things are inextricably linked together. And so you end up being confined to spaces where you are in low resource communities. And so you're really segregated away from access to healthy foods, you're segregated away from access to healthcare, to job opportunities. And so these are not things that are new or that have emerged due to the pandemic, but these are things that are longstanding within our communities, and it really exposes a structural problem that has been longstanding that we have not really addressed over the course of the founding and the development of these cities. And so we have seen particularly in the post-industrial cities, such as Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, we've seen a decline, but then also this revitalization, which hasn't really impacted these other communities that are poor and low income. What we have seen, particularly in the city that I reside in, is zoning and restrictions that have further segregated the people with wealth and the people without wealth from one another. And so this egregious health disparity, this egregious inequality in terms of finances is something that we have to begin to address, because it's something that impacts the whole of society. So if we have individuals who have limited access to appropriate ways to prevent chronic disease, we're going to have a sicker population, which is going to have implications on us. I think the other interesting thing that Don brought up, and also Peter brought up, related to density, these are questions that we're beginning to talk about, because when you also begin to look at the data, you see that the cases are concentrated in urban centers. But once again, as you zoom in closer on those urban centers, you see that it's really spaces that have been on the margins that are suffering disproportionately. And these are largely related to the inequalities that exist within our economic structure. So I think I'm gonna wait. I have a few more things that I wanna say, but I wanna give Susanne time to provide her comments. I'm gonna pass it over to Susanne.
Thank you very much, Fran, and hello to everyone. I'm very excited to also speak to the United States. Hello, US. And as Don and Fran already pointed to very important issues and numbers, I would like to mention some more general aspects that probably help us to understand how to develop our future cities when thinking about what comes after COVID in our cities to healthy and sustainable and just places for everyone. And to be honest, I can only agree to what Don and Fran already pointed out. The origin of an individual, the social position, the income and the education of each person, all these things play a major role for the health risk of the people. And this is nothing new. We already knew this a long time, but this is the way, and this is all over the world the same. So we have the same numbers and probably the same pattern as Fran already pointed out. And this is independent of whether it is the risk of getting diabetes or heart attacks or all these kinds of chronic diseases. It's independent also of having the risk of being infected by COVID or suffering from the aftermath of the lockdown. So, and this is also why the origin, the income, the education of the people also determines at which places they are living and if these places are good or not so good for their health. So place matters when it comes to health. And to make it a bit more concrete, and Don and Fran already pointed that out, urban health is influenced by a number of factors of the social and spatial environment, like neighborhood cohesion, is it good or not? Traffic congestion, like you all know of these things like noise and air pollution, but also the quality and access and the amount of green spaces and leisure facility. And all these things are influencing the health of the people. And it's also the health of the people is directly shaped by political and social action. We have to take this in mind. And this altogether means changing lifestyle for an individual, what we are already talking about. You have to eat better food, you must eat more healthy things, you must be more healthy or more physically active, you should stop smoking, you should achieve a good education, living in a good environment and stuff like that. Also these lifestyle things is getting more and more difficult for an individual, the more of these risks an individual has to suffer or is present for this individual. And given this, we have to move from these personal factors to a wide range of other factors that are influencing our health. So social factors and environment factors and political factors are, to say it in more general words, the urban development affects the health of the people each day at each place of the city. And this probably sounds very easy, but in reality, almost every one of us knows that in reality, almost every day we experience the difficulties to get these things into play, especially when it comes to sustaining or promoting health. And this is because we only think about health when it's absent. So all over the world, we are now talking about health measures in all sciences, in all politics, even in each families, we are talking about health. But because of the COVID pandemic. But when there is not such a disaster, or if the people feel healthy, we don't care anymore so much about sustaining health or health promotion. And it's a kind of prevention paradox. If the prevention works, or if health promotion is successful, we often forget about it. So talking about cities, we mostly address also the risk on negative aspects. But what about the wonderful and healthy things? And we know there are lots of them. So we have to take care to recognize and preserve these positive things. And probably you see some parallels to our environment and to save our nature and to take care of the climate. We have to recognize this, and not only when there are disasters or when things are getting bad. So this is very general, but nevertheless, there are also lots of reports and documents. So it's nothing new I'm talking about, but there is one of these documents, just to show you one. So probably also Peter may give a link for this, which is a healthy urban development checklist. And looking at this healthy urban development checklist, it shows you already in very easy words all the different kinds of factors that is sustaining your health, and this is promoting your health. And it shows that we need a lot of professions, that we need the people, that we need a lot of professions, and that we need a broad administration that takes care and asks all the time, what kind of measures and how are these affecting the people and the places and certain groups, population groups, and so on and so on. And yeah, with this, I would like to stop. As the others stop also, although there's much more to say about that.
Well, thank you, Françoise, Fran, and Susan. I'm going to address a couple questions to you and then turn this over to Peter to moderate the questions from the online audience. And you certainly keep coming with your questions. I'll start with you, Fran. In Pittsburgh, our mayor has promoted something he calls One Pittsburgh, and he has an equity commission as well. And his statement sums that up is, if it's not for all, it's not for us. And so we also have, an African-American population, but a growing Latino population. And also we're also kind of welcoming refugees from the Middle East and Africa and other places. So we're trying to deal with housing related to that and public health services as best we can. My question to you is, Françoise, you're in Cincinnati and your research has turned up certain things about neighborhoods and ethnic groups. What is Cincinnati doing in this realm, both before COVID and now COVID and after COVID?
So I think that our city council has been working within neighborhoods, particularly working with community councils within neighborhoods to be able to provide funding for opportunities of economic growth and development. I know the couple neighborhoods that I work specifically in, which has the lowest life expectancy for Cincinnati. So it's somewhere around 20 years less life expectancy on average in one of the neighborhoods that I currently, do work in. And so there are a lot of local organizations that are doing work. So particularly working in neighborhoods has really been doing a significant amount of work with that particular community for economic development, and working with the city council and the neighborhood council to be able to try to get funding into the neighborhood for development, particularly looking at, because it's also considered a food desert by definition. It is working on trying to develop sustainable food practices and create a food ecosystem that actually includes the community members to be able to help with developing business there, to be able to have viable jobs within the community, but then also working on home ownership as well. So I feel like within the city of Cincinnati, there are a lot of organizations doing work and getting buy-in from the city council as well. But I think that anytime you have a large or a kind of mid-sized city and politics are involved, sometimes these different things get kind of gummed up. But I do feel like we are making progress within the city due to a lot of kind of grassroots movements and activists getting involved and advocating and pushing for policy change. I'm kind of an activist by heart. I started off in this work doing activist work and protesting, and so I'm still kind of in those spaces and have a number of friends who are dedicated to doing equity work and being out protesting and pushing politicians to make better choices for the community as a whole. And so I think that we're kind of in this balancing act of Cincinnati with trying to redevelop the city, but then also trying to make sure that we're not leaving people behind in that redevelopment. So I think there's some tension that's been there within our city. And I think that tension is still here and will kind of remain as we're kind of navigating COVID as well. I can say that All In Cincinnati, which is another organization and activist group, has in the past few weeks really been calling for a task force around COVID-19 and minority communities. And so right now they're in the process of putting together a task force to really begin to look at this particular issue in conjunction with Closing the Health Gap, which is an organization that's received some funds from the city of Cincinnati, and it's dedicated to health equity for minority communities.
Well, thank you very much, Fran. Susan, I'd like to follow up on something you mentioned in your talks relating to outdoor space and recreation space and recreation space and green space, and the impact it has not only on your body as exercising, but what it does overall to the community in terms of cohesion and community health. And specifically, I wanted to ask you, what impact do current preventive health measures have on the use and relevance of public space today and then in the future as we try to deal with the impacts of future pandemics?
Thank you, Don. I think the pandemic and the lockdown shows very, very good, especially also in Germany, that in cities, it's very important to have green areas and access to green areas, because in Germany, the lockdown was not so strict that people were allowed to go outside with the children and with the 2 persons. And lots of people used that and went to open spaces, to the green, sitting down in the sun and stuff like that. And they made a lot of release for these people. However, not everyone is able to have these places around, because you were not allowed to go somewhere 2 or 3 or 5 kilometers away from your home. So those people who are living in more poorer neighborhoods that have less access to green, and they don't have a balcony or a small garden or something like that, for them we see now the double burden they have. They have small flats and they have not many, and lots of people are living in these flats and they don't have access to green. So we need much more access to these greens or areas, and stuff like urban gardenings or greening the roofs or other kinds of measures are thinkable for the future if we have something like that again, and probably we do have these pandemics again. And we know now that it's very important to have these things. For instance, if you have urban gardening, you could think about managing this in a small neighborhood, taking apps, and then by the apps, you're just talking about who is able to go to the garden and take care of it. And with this, you have a social cohesion somehow in your neighborhood and still have the possibility to go outside and do things together, even just growing some healthy foods. This is with the outdoor space and the greens, and also, of course, the quality of green, and also thinking about what about children? So the children were those who have to be inside, and you know, everyone who has a child or observes child know they need a lot of movement. They need a lot of possibility to move, and we have to think, how can we realize this even in such times like these ones?
Don, we don't understand you. You have to turn on your mic.
I'm going to turn this back over to you, Peter, and we have about 25 minutes for you to bring us questions from the greater audience that's out there, and we look forward to hearing from them.
Thank you very much, Don, Fran, and Susan. And we got a lot of questions in, one of which is addressed to all of you. If you could wave a wand, what would be the first public project you would undertake to change cities? Susan, do you want to start?
Yeah, there's the very first, oh, this is difficult because there's so many I would like to change. I think one of the big things are right now are changing the food path and the cycling lanes, because the pandemic shows that people are at least in Germany, lots of people now change going by bike and going by food, and not by food, but you know, walking. And you know, we much more need changes in this way and think about these things, because right now they are used to do that, and it's a really great thing. And this would be one of the first things to further address these things, because this makes our cities much more healthy than before.
Thank you. Fran?
Like Susanna, there are so many different projects, but I think the thing that keeps sticking in my mind is the issue of housing. And so we already know that, particularly in urban settings, particularly the history here in the US has been to develop housing projects within low-income spaces, and to cordon off those different spaces by either constructions of highways through neighborhoods or erecting walls around certain neighborhoods, which limits people's ability to have access to resources. So not being able to access healthy food, not being able to access your physician, or not being able to access public transportation due to being relatively cut off from the rest of the city. And so I think that would be something that I would start off with, just because looking at the GIS data here in Cincinnati, the thing that I keep looking at is that it's really this issue of poverty and issue of place due to not being able to access housing, and also because housing stock has been relatively low, being priced out of that housing stock due to poverty. And so it places individuals who are already at risk in neighborhoods that are segregated away from resources, which compounds chronic health problems, which then further exacerbates a pandemic type situation. So.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, the thing that came to mind is mobility. What I've been observing both here and in Europe is this aversion to public transit right now, that perhaps if you go there and you're in the subway or the underground or the metro or whatever, buses or whatever, as a result of that, and people being locked down, the transit systems are losing money big, and they're getting huge deficits. And so I think my mobility is very important to low-income people as well. Housing is important, but so is mobility to get to jobs, healthcare, school, whatever it is. And I think it's a big issue. It's not just the public transit system, it's multimodal. It's like promoting bicycle lanes, safe pedestrian ways to get to places, share rides like Uber, and those kinds of things as an overall policy. How can we especially make the people who are marginalized and disadvantaged get to the places they need to be in an inexpensive way? I was just listening to the mayor of Dortmund and the mayor of Pittsburgh talking about this very thing. And in Dortmund, what they're seeing is an increase in the use of e-bikes during this shutdown, which he saw as a very positive thing, because if they're not using the transit system, you don't want them to be driving their cars. So if people are comfortable with e-bikes or scooters, that might be a way to go. And they've also seen a huge uptick in bikes, as we've seen in the United States. Bike stores have remained open because they're considered essential businesses. So people are buying bikes, people that have never biked before. Now they're biking more for exercise and just to get out, but maybe more will begin to commute that way. So my one answer to public project is increase mobility.
Great, thank you very much. There's a kind of a follow-up question to that, which refers to transportation and communications from the town halls and city halls in this country and in Germany. And the question is, how can mayors in general reach out to all the different neighborhoods and populations to ensure that rules are followed and social distancing, for example, is kept in place? Maybe Susan and Fran, you want to address that? Do we see any examples of mayors very efficiently communicating and enforcing these rules?
I think this is well organized in Germany, and the majors, they have, of course, their whole administration stuff, and they have certain kinds of like Ordnungsamt. I don't know the English word for Ordnungsamt. Probably you, Peter, know that better. But there are already some structures that take care that these kinds of rules are held, and then these rules and things are very done. And even the people with each other. So if someone is going into a shop, they tell each other, oh, you forgot your protection and stuff like that. So this is not of discussion in Germany. I can't realize any of these things. It works probably well.
Great, thank you, Susan. Fran, can you provide us with the Cincinnati perspective?
So I think that thus far there have been a lot of kind of town hall meetings that have been occurring, and this is specifically to try to do more outreach to non-white communities. So trying to basically get buy-in. I think that in America, there can be a lot of distrust of the medical establishment, distrust of the government as well. And so I think that you really need to try to tailor your message and really try to find entities that are already embedded within communities, within neighborhoods, to be able to push forward a message, so that way there's actually buy-in, and so that way people are actually willing to adhere to the messaging. So I know the Closing the Health Gap of Greater Cincinnati has done some webinars. On the Health Collaborative of Cincinnati has done webinars as well to do outreach in that particular way. Those are just two that come to mind. I've attended a couple of those webinars that were specifically geared toward the African American community here. But then also, I think that our mayor here has also done well with holding press conferences as well, and promoting messages, and stores putting up signage as well to try to engage people in adhering to the recommendations.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Fran. And I think a question that came in for Don, because you worked on cities in transition, post-industrial cities. The question is, and I'm trying to combine two questions that just came in, what are the political processes for change in cities, and what are ideal coalitions of change agents? How does change come about as a joint effort of policymakers and communities?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a good question. And some stark realities have come forward here as a result of COVID-19, not only here in the States, but I also know that's happening in Germany. There's a political aspect to all of this. So now people feel that this shutdown is somehow taking away their rights, and people are pushing back. In fact, the mayor of Dortmund and the mayor of Pittsburgh both gave examples of people who were opposed to the government infringing on their freedoms. We're seeing, and the issue of this is there are federal government regulations, there are state government regulations, and there are city government regulations. And right now, at least in the United States, it's very confusing. And we're getting messages from all three levels of government about what the rules are. And it's very confusing. And I think the same thing may be how you're shaking your head, Susan, same thing may be happening there. And it's all infused with this left-wing, right-wing politics. And that may be the elephant in the room here today, is to come up with a common policy that everybody's going to agree upon, whether it's access to open space or opening schools or spending money on transit. It's going to be seen through this lens of really divisive politics. Some of the worst I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm not happy about it. But what COVID-19 did was pull back the curtain about what was already there, and it's made it even more stark. So to the answer to the question, I always believe in the lowest level of government being the best one to solve the problems for the people in their own cities. They know their city better. As you go up the chain, people are less knowledgeable about the ethnic breakup of your city, the history of it, its culture, its norms. So I would hope to empower cities and mayors and city councils and local health departments to be the ones on the front line of these things, and for them to establish what the norm is with their own constituencies. But that's a very good question and remains unresolved in my view.
Thank you, Dawn. Susan, do you want to provide a German perspective on this?
A short remark, because in Germany we have something in between. We have the federal government, and we also have the single states, probably you know. And during the serious phase of the epidemic or the pandemic, everything went from the Chancellor Merkel. She said, we are doing this, and she very clearly communicated with the people. And then there's suddenly, now what I said before, the prevention paradox, now the numbers went down. We were very successful with the prevention measures because we could keep very low, and the infection rates were very slow and not that high. And the death, of course, they are still bad with 7,000, but it's still very low. So we were very, very successful with that. But now everyone is talking now about the reopening, and then suddenly everyone comes out and tries to get in the front. And now we have the discussion from the right wings. We have the strange theories of, because Bill Gates is, of course, the one who does all these viruses and stuff like that. So very strange things. And now it's not anymore the discussion or the chancellor who is taking over. Now the cities and the federal states are taking over. And now it's getting much more difficult to know what's going on here. And the political parties and those who have certain powers try to take over. And this is now a very, very sensitive phase we are in. And I think we have to take care very much about who takes over, who has the meaning, who has the and who has the power. And it's not only about the right and left wings, it's also about sustainability, now everyone is talking, oh, we don't need any more these climate change things. We need economy to be very strong again. So they try to get all these measures to protect our climate. And this is a very sensitive phase. And I get we should work together, even in an alliance, be it United States and Germany or whatever. We need an alliance to be very strong to struggle all these things, because now it's what Don already said.
Thank you very much, Susan. And you know, you mentioned the phase that we are currently in, negotiating, different stakeholders negotiating the reopening of cities. Fran, there is a question that you might want to answer from someone who wonders about the trade-off between opening schools and virtual learning in the fall, specifically in relation to low-income communities, precisely because public schools play such an important role in providing necessities such as positive social interactions in those neighborhoods.
So the question is, once again, kind of related to the tension or the balance between opening and then remaining shut, right? Correct, okay. So I think that, you know, within the low-income community, we've seen just a tremendous need in relation to food, particularly in those neighborhoods where a large proportion of the students are either receiving free or reduced lunch. And so the school systems here in Ohio have done a tremendous job of being able to feed students. Initially, they were handing out meals and having the students come to be able to receive the meals on every other day basis. And then they kind of got more efficient at it as we went on to be able to pack up a week's worth of meals for students and then have just one guardian come and retrieve those meals for those particular students to be able to have some sort of sustenance while they're at home. However, it still poses a challenge of only having 2 meals per day, potentially only getting 80% of their recommended daily intake for calories, which we all know has implications long-term in terms of behavior, in terms of cognition. But then also the other dilemma that the schools have faced being online is that a number of the students did not have access to internet or did not have access to a computer. And so a lot of the work was trying to be done either on limited internet access through a smartphone and limited plans depending on what the plan was. And so I have several colleagues that are in education and several individuals who I interact who are K through 12 teachers. And so on any given week, somewhere around a quarter of their students would actually check in for weekly assignments to be able to go through the process of moving forward in their educational trajectory. And so the longer we are in shutdown, the greater negative impacts it's potentially going to have on student learning and also on food insecurity. And we're already seeing those numbers for children who are food insecure rising due to being shut down. So I think that it's something that I'm very concerned about, something that I keep thinking about in terms of how do we negotiate this, how do we navigate this? And I think that it's going to take a lot of input to be able to either improve upon what we have to be able to stay closed, but then to be able to provide students with appropriate resources to be able to receive the education that they need and deserve, or going through the process of figuring out how do we open up and do so in a safe manner. And I think that I know that we're still having discussions about that as a university, and I think that it's just going to be a challenge either way. I don't have any real answer other than to say that we're going to have educators, we're going to have the public health experts, we're going to have families involved in this conversation, because ultimately it impacts families if we send their students back. And then we're going to have technology companies involved in this, communication companies involved, figure out viable ways to be able to educate and keep students safe. So it's that setting up hotspots in low-income neighborhoods, which is something that Dayton, Ohio did. They basically turned some of their school buses into hotspots in some of the low-income neighborhoods, and they received donated laptops and were able to send students who did not have access to those laptops away with laptops to be able to log in and do work. But the other problem that comes up is that you still have to have someone there supervising. So if we open up and if we send, if parents end up going back to work, then there's no one there to supervise that educational process either. So it's really complicated. I don't know if Susanne has any thoughts or comments on it, but
I think we have to try. We have to try and figure out, and we have to think about very intelligent solution. The problem you already talked about, that I think it's important that these children are going back to school or somewhere where they have more attention, where they get more attention and food and stuff like that. But how we can do that, I think it's again something which has to be solved locally in the small communities. It might be everywhere a bit different, and I think thinking about the risk, I think there should be some solution to take the view of the children and to say, how can we get a solution for that? And there are solutions, but we have to take the view also from the children and not only from somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that particularly following up on both of you is the digital divide that you've talked about, that, you know, poor families don't have the same access to computers, internet, or any number of things like that. So that's one problem. The second problem is, as opposed to a middle-class family that has a rec room where the kids can go to school, in a household with many children and maybe grandparents, there's no place for the children to be quiet and do their studies or even interact, even if they had the computer. Where do they go? And so the wealth gap just multiplies the problems related to that. And school for children of poor families is the most organized and disciplined place they are during the week a lot of times. That's their second home. They socialize there. Their teachers are watching out for them. Some are actually parents in loco, you know, they're taking advantage of the time they spend with the children to help them forward with their studies and their health and their mental health. So when they're not in school, they don't have access to any of that now, and they're falling behind in their studies as well. So it's compounded when they can't actually be in the school where all these services are available to them.
Thank you very much, Don. We have many, many more questions, but we have to wrap it up slowly. We only have 2 more minutes. And in these challenging times, I do want to end on a positive note and ask all of you, with all of these challenges that we currently face, have you seen certain opportunities that were created that point towards the future? Like, has the pandemic already translated into something that you think is a path towards more sustainable cities? If you could just name 1 or 2 examples. Fran, do you want to start?
Sure. So I live actually in the city limits of Cincinnati. And so I think the thing that has been really encouraging to me to see is neighbors who have never interacted now kind of interacting. And so I'm seeing a greater community cohesion with people helping out with people, also engaging in artistic and creative endeavors. There's a great display in the neighborhood that I currently live in where they're doing scare coronas. And so they've made scarecrows and kind of done this coronavirus theme to them. And they're somewhere over, I think, 130 installations now throughout the neighborhood. And so they've created a Facebook event where people can walk, keeping appropriate social distancing and wearing masks, to come by different houses and see these particular creative displays. And so I think that's really reassuring for me that somehow through all of this, we are coming more together.
Thank you very much, Fran. Susan? You have to turn on your mic.
I had to Google a word. I think what is a positive thing is that people, as Fran already said, that people learn or discover the neighbors and the neighborhoods, because they have now a small area and they have to keep there, and suddenly they discover the neighborhoods. And I'm very happy, or I would looking forward if these neighbors keep staying in touch and not acknowledge the new cohesion they have, and the social cohesion. For instance, in Leeds, my son is working in Leeds, they are now cooking for people who were not allowed to go outside anymore, and now they know their neighbors, and hopefully there are lots of these kinds of actions, and this is very positive, I think, and we have to try to keep that.
Thank you very much, Don.
I would use the same term, community cohesion. I see it. My wife and I actually shop for one of our neighbors when we go to the grocery store. I see that happening. In fact, when we're out walking, people are more friendly. You know, when you pass them by on a trail or whatever you're doing, they'll nod and smile at you. Before, they just walk right past you. Now they're acknowledging you. The second thing is human ingenuity. Just think of all the things that have happened. Fran's already talked about the art thing. You know, remember, it started in Italy, in Mellon. They would go out on their balconies and they would sing and they would play their instruments and things. But then this afternoon, I'm going to be on a Zoom cocktail party with some friends of mine. You know, who would have thought you would have been doing something like that? And, you know, finding a vaccine, finding cures. I mean, there are lots of people working 24 hours a day to try to figure all this out. So, you know, once again, I think we have to trust the basic humanity of people, even in the midst of this political divisiveness. But basically, when you get to know somebody person to person, that's what life is all about. And I think if our communities can come together like I see them trying to do, I say our mayors on the front line in particular, trying to be the leaders and bringing the community together, making the community feel safe and ready to re-engage itself. So community cohesiveness and human engineering and ingenuity are what make me feel good and allow me to wake up in the morning at least with a partial smile on my face.
Wonderful, wonderful, beautifully said. Thank you so much, Don. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Fran. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to the audience members for engaging with us. I'm sorry we couldn't post and answer all of the questions that you had, but join us for our next event. Follow us on Twitter and all of the social media. Thanks again. Have a wonderful weekend. And most importantly, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Be well.